This is a journey between 2 points, born of an experience travelling east to west from exterior to interior and out again, on one of the original North American transcontinental railways. Across an extended natural landscape, experienced from within the constant of a rail car and its wider social, cultural and historical network, a critical reflection upon the mediation of space, time and action dynamically frames that which is open and that which is liminal. It is a piece of design fiction intended to textually depict our hero's narrative arc as they travel from one state to another. This is a sweeping cinemascope survey drawing on the filmic quality of the journey, establishing the parallel development of cinema and that of the Transcontinental Railroad in running commentary to a practice of environmental design. It cuts between common emphasis on apparatus of experience, temporality and movement in space and the structures that frame it, and an ensuing reconceptualization of the way in which we orient within the contemporary age. This is a journey between 2 points, specifically the urban centres of Toronto and Vancouver, east and west termini on Canada's transcontinental railway route, the Great Western Way. The long-distance train as a structure that holds open a contemplative space against the pressures of habit, familiarity and distraction is a start point for reflection on how we might reframe experiences around a mobilised perspective within multivalent contemporary terrain. Our journey begins in the late 19th century with the modern project's call for mastery and possession of nature brought to bear in a willfully disruptive expansion across territories. As burgeoning icons of modernity, the railway and cinema heralded new systems of spatial organisation and experience that set out to confront and redefine boundaries. From orders of perspective to liberated modes of perception, the way in which we saw and understood the world began to shift by means of such mechanically motivated bodies that colonised minds as much as physical reality through constructions of experience and subjectivity. Advancing scientific thought around relativity and uncertainty underscored a world that was unmooring from its foundation in absolutes. When the Lumiere brothers first presented actuality film Arrivée d'un train in 1896, audience members were famously reported to have run in fright for fear that the life-size train would continue its one-point perspective trajectory from screen into the space of the auditorium. In a neat coalescence of themes, cinema's founding myth illustrates the extent to which fixed constructs of exteriority and interiority were being opened up and moved through on a spatial, temporal and psychological level. The subject is mobilised. Writing 1 century later, Paul Virilio continued the interest in technology and communications as they pertain to the mediated experience of how we live, work and move within the contemporary age. Anticipating something of our present condition, 1982's Lost Dimension contemplated a city of permanent transit and internalised borders where time has overtaken space. The worldview based on orthogonal orthodoxy has given way to a new perception in which the very concept of physical dimension has progressively lost its meaning and analytical power as a form of dissecting or dismounting perceptive reality. Our journey, both that of the train and this resulting critical reflection, is established over a 3-act structure bearing out departure, exposition, transit, the confrontation, and arrival, denouement. As a complete world that takes place within a larger frame, any narrative-based construction might be considered to create a form of interior. What is a story? A chain of events in cause-effect relationship occurring in space and time. Writing on the explosion of space, Anthony Vidler considers the potential of filmic techniques to render a version of reality that might otherwise go unrecorded, or, better, to reconstrue reality in such a way that it might be critically apprehended. We begin and end in what is known as Hollywood of the North. Both Toronto and Vancouver, as exemplars of the East Coast City and West Coast City respectively, are established backlots, doubling for popular North American film and television locations. Yet responding to the specific, if generic, qualities of each, and perhaps reflective of a larger East-West archetypal psychology of space, it may be observed that Toronto mostly recurs as the day-to-day metropolis, where Vancouver regularly drifts into worlds of sci-fi and fantasy. Some resonance can be found in a brief consideration of their histories. What we now recognise as Toronto grown up around trade and industry following its formal establishment as a military base, might be seen as something of an island condition. Sitting atop the land, it surveyed and now sprawls in all directions. Conceptually established around maintaining stasis, it looked out defensively. In contrast, Vancouver, located within an inhospitable perimeter of mountains and coastline, could be considered more as a kind of oasis, active for centuries as a meeting place where it drew people in around the collection and sharing of diverse natural resources. Despite the topology, it was a place of movement and unfixedness about looking out openly. Both cities, as we now know them, were established by settlers around the turn of the 18th century, upon pre-existing lands and indigenous cultures in a swell of Western European global expansionism that evolved into the modern industrial age. The railway catalysed this ever-westward movement, collecting such distinct locales as Toronto and Vancouver within a singular continental infrastructure, a grand narrative to be experienced as a space in and of itself. Running broadly coast to coast or edge to edge of the North American continent's central landmass, the thrust of our journey takes place in the in-between suspended landscape and my memory of those days on board. The rails are fixed, the route predetermined, as in the movie theatre, where the interior functions to establish a near-continuous connection between the audience and film, the spectacle projected within an enclosed space on a depthless screen, creating a strongly directed movement into the film, out of reality. Here, too, a suspension of perception is maintained along the railroad track. Over the unhurried duration of the transcontinental service, as it variously quickens, slows, pauses, is overtaken, within the singular forwards motion, there is a sensation of slippage, as clouds, trees, rock formations, bodies of water, passing freight, buildings and signalling infrastructure track back and forth in discordant rhythm. One's perception of position in time and space is loosened. In the fixed, single-point perspective of the rails and framed views through car windows, there is a similar disconnect in the ordering and flattening of such an expansive territory. Our second act spans the interior of the North American continent and traverses three distinct landscapes, the Shield, the Prairies and the Rockies, as experienced from within the train car. The journey is examined through its constructing elements related to scenographic devices, the route, the outline, the train, the set, the landscape, a rolling backdrop, and passengers, the cast, brought together over a 5-day period punctuated by breakfast, lunch and dinner services in a series of evolving set pieces. Characterised by lakes, ponds, swamps, forests and rocky outcrops, the Canadian Shield is a vast, undulating landscape left behind from the Ice Age. The immediacy of Toronto's urban centre dissolves into the deep time of the intercontinent and an expanse that moves fluidly between wide and close, what anthropologists might call a conceal and reveal or refuge and prospect landscape, taken in quick burst, shutter-like eye movements. The sight of the long-distance train, begun as a branded empty vessel, has acquired meaning and memory as generated by its rolling ensemble of passengers and those who use it to situate a narrative. Within classical film tropes, the long-distance train sets up significant plot points, serving as a framing construct wherein its anonymity and organisation around a consistent programme of spaces and service provide the backdrop for all sorts of thrills and redirections of expectation. Such narratives are typically set up in the public spaces of the lounge and dining cars, key interiors where characters gather and are introduced to each other, and so in real life. In the compressed reality of the train, the dining room is a microcosm of society. Organised around fixed tables of 4, with passengers mostly couples or solo travellers, a degree of spontaneity or Russian roulette takes place in the seating plan. Unlike in cafe culture or contemporary dining scenarios, where informal furniture and serving establishes a negotiation of communal space, here, localised lighting, Thonate-style seating, table linen, silverware and waiter service organise and make intimate what can be a strange bumping up of realities. And yet, the highly structured set of the dining car, with its extensive props and rotating cast of actors as potential plot agents, the scenery very much peripheral with gaze directed across the tables, felt to be the perfect stage for world building. The film tells us this human story by overcoming the forms of the outer world, namely space, time and causality, and by adjusting the events to the forms of the inner world, namely attention, memory, imagination, and emotion. As the landscape is rendered through the glazing as a series of framed, flattened views, fellow passengers, strangers inevitably in character sketch only, for these are brief encounters, become a series of ciphers, offering alternate views and voices to one's own preoccupations, a mobilised perspective. Just as the landscape outside shifts and undulates, so this section of the narrative is about movement, getting one's bearings as they relate variously to territories of the interior, geography, vaguely, for there are no particular landmarks to reference, the train, locating the various lounge cars in relation to one's berth, and that of the passenger themselves. Perhaps vaguer still, how am I feeling about where I am at this point in the journey through these inner and outer worlds? In contrast to the dining car, lounges appear altogether more informal. Effectively a lower deck to the observation area, which we'll come to later, the lounge is set down from all other levels of the train. Responding to this lower ceiling height, its windows are reproportioned to widescreen and form, when seated, a field of vision that crops any view of the tracks and therefore vanishing point. It's a close tracking shot that immerses one in the foreground landscape over what lies on the horizon. Vinyl bunket seating runs down both sides of the car and breaks out towards the centre in a few places, creating offset corner seating to occasional dining height tables. In what is essentially a passing point in one long corridor, this modulation creates a sense of in-the-round enclosure, making guests feel comfortable to sit in a range of orientations with varying degrees of exposure and engagement with the view and/or fellow passengers. Decorative finishes in a palette of pale blue and grey plastic continue the light of the panoramic sky and imbue the interior with a particular calm and reverence. It's an interior that brings the exterior in, or, looked at another way, allows the passenger to drift out. At 4 o'clock each day, access to the park car, the prestige class lounge and bar, is extended to all sleeper passengers. Despite first-day anxiety that this hour would mark something of an opening of floodgates, it turns out that distance, having to walk up to 16 carriages on something that feels like a vibration platform workout, is a great divide. But, true to the American dream, if you work hard enough, you can make it. A couple of steps up to the lounge establishes the sense of arrival, a leaving behind of everything and most everyone else. Located at the rear of the train, this car is unique in being a terminating rather than transitional space, a genuine destination. Featuring distinctive tapering in plan, reflective of the fleet's 1950s streamlined design, perimeter bunket seating curves discreetly inwards. Through a combination of generously constructed depth and non-orthogonal layout, the seating establishes an indirect condition whereby people feel able, but not forced, to engage with one another across the open floor. The overall mood is one of ease. The 2019 refurbishment in oak and walnut veneer panelling and dark grey textiles distinctly breaks the spectral continuity between inside and out referenced elsewhere. This is a strongly defined internal space that foregrounds its passengers. The exterior experienced very much as background through 270-degree framed cross views, a series of cutaways in which landscape, taken in long oblique angles, one would have to awkwardly twist backwards to view it directly flat on, jumps amorphously between what is ahead and what is behind. It doesn't seem to matter. The car's end window forms one natural point of focus in which everything is referenced back to the origin point at the meeting of the tracks. Anticipated by passengers with a mix of marvel and dread, the central section of the interior territory is characterised by homogeneous, wide-open flatland. Our journey through it goes on for days, and there's a feeling of happy suspension in the near total absence of anything, the fear of missing out that underscores contemporary waking life and indeed shaped our movement through the Shield, both in terms of the landscape and explorations of the train, no longer applies. Jonathan Crary on Attention, Spectacle and Modern Culture: spectacular culture is not founded on the necessity of making a subject see, but rather on strategies in which individuals are isolated, separated, and inhabit time as disempowered. Standard accommodation divides into three main types: sections with upper and lower sleeper berths, single occupancy roomettes, and two-person compartments, bunked rooms. All are adequately spacious if requiring some degree of acrobatic negotiation, and Swiss Army knife ingenuity to pivot from daytime to nocturnal arrangement. The clearest distinction between sections and rooms, then, is in the physicality of their definition. Compartments with doors and sliding panel roomettes remain formally defined spaces with a threshold that communicates private, whereas berths are effectively returned to open space, common area and daytime. As with any communal domicile scenario, it comes down to the need for assertion of personal boundaries, and in this, the different accommodations engage with some of the most elemental aspects of interior space construction. Neolithic man's hanging of animal furs on timber props has been suggested as the original constructed space. Before architecture, it was about the configuration of textile product to create a differentiated atmosphere. Later, as a sense of self evolved along with domestic standards, the need for intimate space was addressed through draped screens to recesses, corners and bed frames, which could then be reopened to day use. As the way in which most live now tends toward the ever more refined and defined, the need for such economy of means around threshold creation is moot. The sleeper train is notable for taking us back to a more theatrical unfolding of story in space, a proliferation of special effects altering consciousness of time, distance, and our perception of the environment. In his treatise on space experienced by humans, Otto Bollnoff considers the bed and its corresponding horizontal alignment remarkable, insofar as, when we lie down in order to sleep, this is not just a movement within space where space stands still and we move in it, but there is a basic change in the relationship between man and experienced space itself. The climax of our narrative arc builds in tandem with the external landscape. Passengers wait to the sight of the rocky mountain range thrown up behind the last of the grassland in a graduated blend with mixed forestry and waterways. Following long days of the nondescript, here finally is a great singular defined feature, a locus point, prairie, the state of being suspended, a looking or listening so rapt that it is an exemption from ordinary conditions that it becomes a suspended temporality, a hovering out of time. Attention implies the possibility of a fixation, folding something in wonder or contemplation, in which the attentive subject is both immobile and ungrounded, but at the same time, a suspension is also an interruption, a disturbance, even a negation of perception itself. Where night space might be characterised as the removal of elements linked with visibility, the essential feature of day space lies in the fact that we can oversee it in its entire extent. Taking an assessment of space experienced and lived by humans through the modern period, Vidler writes that it has been increasingly defined as a product of subjective projection and introjection, as opposed to a stable container of objects and bodies. It might be suggested that the space of modern identity locates in an intermediate and unfixed space between things. Where the shield played out through the day, the prairies at night, this final stretch of territory comes to feel more like a waking dream. All sense of time and movement slows, and a peculiar distortion takes place in the foregrounding of the mountain backdrop that, in contrast to scenery through the rest of the journey, appears constant, postponed for hours on end despite our progression along the track. In the contained space of the train, where passenger movement is linear, backwards and forwards, the cut here to vertical circulation up a flight of steps into the observation deck is experientially significant. A clear feeling of moving into a different atmosphere is most directly manifest through the wraparound glazed sides and ceiling that take form above the passenger as they rise up into the space. The deck is flooded in flat light. Reflections start to behave differently. The boundary softens. Observation deck seating is in pairs on either side of a central aisle facing forwards. Like on a bus where passengers cycle on and off with no particular urgency or commitment, happy to engage indirectly to a continuous rolling of scenery outside the window, away from the through traffic and bar sales of lower lounges, these are the conditions for unexpected ephemeral connections, as though being enclosed in ritual space with nothing to do but listen and watch. In contrast to the rest of the train, where interiors have been studied to more distinctly establish collective or personal space, here is Bollnoff's space between the near and the distant, an abstracted present not dissimilar to that of being immersed in cinema, where one is suspended between actuality and mental projection, the external narrative of the screenplay, and inner mental space of the audience as mediated by the environmental design of the theatre. And like in a dream, come nightfall, suddenly everyone is gone and it's just you. In contrast to the well-lit skyline lounges with their blue gloss surfaces that now pop under electric light, and window reflections that sharply define the interior and those in it against the black outside, the heavy palette of the parked car starts to make sense. With individually switched lights, the Bullet Lounge offers darkness close to that of a cinema, with near continuity between inside and out. Just the same reality check safety lighting dotting the ceiling that here picks out the glass divide with little UFOs. Upstairs, in the observation deck, ambient lighting is restricted to minimal floor-level linear LEDs, yet the curvature of the glazed roof obscures any kind of precise view up to the stars, and so the gaze comes to rest upon the length of the train as the only point of reference within this landscape. Act 3 marks the completion of our interior crossing. The Canadian, a trip between two contemporary cities, terminates at Vancouver's Central Station, and we re-emerge on the other side, outside, a little soft. Expansion into the North American West was led by the grid as it subdued geography through an urbanization of the frontier. Territory advanced indefinitely in a man-made rather than natural order through the growth of cities and their subsequent networking. The national railroads were an intrinsic part of this growth, their roots coming to be a process of colonisation emanating from the urban centre, and so on this particular journey with a line that runs centre to centre from eastern to western metropolis. In his writing on the continuous endless interior, Mark Pimlett characterises the expansion thus: American ideas about space and place were forged out of system-based strategies superimposed on the world, and the European from a meeting with the world in which resides the possibility of encounter with otherness. The play of competing modes of engagement, constructs of objectivity and interpretation have shaped this journey, from the experience of a universal system that brings order through mapping and two-dimensional flattening of surface, perspective, which we may relate to projects of national land ordinance, the railroad and colonisation of the West, and consider to be about exteriority, to something altogether more dynamic, based as it is on an evolving individual response to situations and ambiances that shift through space and time, perception, and internalisation as related to the experience of being on the train. It's the idea of the projected view and an intimate reality, the near and distant duality, set up within the transcontinental journey. As one who undertook the Great Western Way, it seems to me that the journey, as a highly structured experience within abstract and sealed interior state, became a place for exploring one's own feelings about things, a place to learn how to look and, more generally, to resensitize to space, time, people, and the cause-effect elements that direct them. We require distance and time to be able to see the mechanisms we thoughtlessly submit to be able to both contemplate and participate, to leave and always come back. On heterotopia, Foucault suggests that they always presuppose a system of opening and closing that both isolates them and makes them penetrable. I return to the idea of structures that can enable evolving dialogues between and inside of people, subjects, and sites, and narrative arcs as joined up journeys from here to there with an individual experience at the centre. Jenny Odell and Resisting the Attention Economy: if attention is a state of openness that assumes there is something new to be seen, it is also true that this state must resist our tendency to declare our observations finished. Odell again: only in regular contact with the tangible ground and sky can we learn how to orient and to navigate in the multiple dimensions that now claim us. The Great Western Way was a journey undertaken chiefly out of curiosity. Just as the well-placed cross-section captures the extremes of a volume in one line, here the range of a territory as cut by its railway and wider industrial, social and cultural development. I was also interested simply in experiencing a sustained cycle of time in a total design. What I didn't anticipate was the very particular experience of exterior and interior on a journey that was its own liminal destination. Here, I surrendered to a system where landscape, the train, and my own mental space melded in a scenario pitched somewhere between objective and subjective reading, a perceptive reality. Systems thinking offers a way of making sense of the world and to predict future outcomes through paying attention to interrelationships, parts within a circular whole. It signals a shift from orthogonal grids and fixed point perspective to a kind of assemblage of different experiences. Hyperlink cinema and its basis in an overarching atmosphere that actively encourages interconnection through complex interplay of cinematic elements or network narratives that map society and the new connections people experience in an age of globalization, is a 21st century film criticism expression that captures how we engage in this era. It's well established in the space of time-based media. What about the real world, where we also face the need for opposing takes, hard cuts, and discontinuities even? As design cultures move increasingly beyond fixed definitions and boundaries, the perception and representation of spaces, objects, and narratives as set around roaming situations and atmospheres and navigated through multiple parallel points of view feels more able to engage with the post-prescriptive nature of our time. A mobilised perspective? I pause this narrative, this series of framed views, by asking whether the non-linear experience within this particular journey between 2 points might lead towards an increasingly pertinent area for critical research on how we represent pasts and revision our futures within immersive spatio-temporal experiences, the building of worlds that we can fluidly move through. In a recent report on experience shift, considering the future of immersive experience and flexing of boundaries to create more dynamic frameworks for design, the consultancy House of Cultural Curiosity reasoned that experiences aren't events which just have external stimulation. An experience takes place in the moment when external factors cause an internal transformation within the person, changes in the way they think, feel, or behave, which resonate long after the event or interaction has taken place. The story continues.